Welcome, John Hopkins alumni and friends. I'm Case McFadden, and I play Dr. Beverly Crusher in the Star Trek world. Today, on Star Trek Day, September 8th, you are joining a thought-provoking discussion and representation of diplomacy in Star Trek with Dr. Darcie Drought-Véjares and Ambassador Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley. This program is going to explore how characters like Geordi La Forge, Riva, and Melora bring disability into the heart of the Federation's mission. How Star Trek reflects real-world models of diplomacy and what these stories can teach us about our future among the stars. Be well, live long and prosper.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us today for this very special Hopkins at Home on Star Trek Day 2025. My name is Darcie Drought-Véjares, and I'm honored to serve your host and moderator for today's conversation. In my day job, I'm a fellow for Korean Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. But in this, I'm also a lifelong admirer of science fiction's power to ask and sometimes answer our biggest questions. So I'm thrilled to welcome you to our Star Trek Day program. It's called To Boldly Go, Disability, Diplomacy, and Star Trek's Vision of the Future. Over this hour, we're going to explore ways that Star Trek tackles issues of inclusion and representation, especially through its portrayals of disability and diplomacy, both within the Federation and across the galaxy. I'm especially delighted because joining us today for this conversation is Ambassador Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley, who's a distinguished diplomat and thought leader, and her career has spanned decades of public service at the highest levels. Ambassador Abercrombie-Winstanley served as the first Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the U.S. Department of State, as well as U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Malta. She's currently a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and also a BBC News contributor on foreign affairs. Her career has taken her from advising U.S. cyber forces to coordinating the largest civilian evacuation since World War II. And her writing has appeared in the New York Times and the Foreign Service Journal. Fittingly for today's program, she is also the co-author of 2 scholarly essays in the New York Review of Science Fiction, Disability in Intergalactic Environments, and Words Are Here on Top, Diplomacy in Star Trek. And I highly recommend looking for these articles. I found them very enjoyable and thought-provoking. In today's conversation, we're going to dive into characters like Geordi La Forge, Riva, and Melora, and how they're challenging our real-world assumptions about disability and ability, as well as how Starfleet's missions reflect and sometimes resist our understanding of global politics and equity in the real world today. So before I begin, I'd like to remind those watching live that you can submit your questions through the chat feature below. We're going to be monitoring throughout the program, and I'm going to collect as many as possible so that we can answer later on during our Q&A session. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Abercrombie-Winstanley.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Darcie.
Thank you. I want to start broadly with what's your connection to Star Trek? What first drew you to the franchise, not just as a viewer, but somebody who's deeply interested in these deeper themes of diplomacy and representation?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that question. You know, we talked a little bit earlier and I was thinking about it. I started watching Star Trek at about age 8. And I then was brought up on the original series. Now, we can talk about the original series because it has issues, especially if you're someone looking for equity as far as women are concerned. But it was an inspiring series. And a few years ago, I actually wrote a letter to Nichelle Nichols, who was about to retire. This is pre-COVID, so 2017, maybe 2018. And I read that letters were going to be read to her at the LA Comic-Con, and when she was going to be doing her final appearance. And I wrote a letter, and so I wanted to share part of it because I think it helps answer your question. I wrote to her that the first time I went out as chief of mission, I was the first woman to lead a diplomatic mission in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Star Trek ideals and values went with me. My call sign was Captain because Nichelle started me on the road to believing I could be a leader. I have boldly gone and proudly served. I'm doing my best to pay it forward to the next generation and hope to echo the positive impact that Nichelle Nichols has had on so many. So that's the second half of the letter that I wrote many years ago, coming up on 10 now. And I will say, actually, that they accepted my letter. And unfortunately, work at the State Department kept me from going and meeting her, but I paid my daughter much money to go in my stead and meet Nichelle Nichols in person. So that reminds me that I thought about leadership and how colleagues and friends from a wide variety of backgrounds can interact with each other in a positive way and get important things done. And I think, in short, that's it.
What is it that you think Star Trek lends it so well to the kinds of explorations of the challenges that we face in our world today, whether it has to do with disability, inclusion, representation? What about particularly about Star Trek do you think is
Yeah.
important?
Yeah. Well, when I think of Star Trek, the three things that come most immediately to mind for the core issues that it addressed, of course, are cultural differences and conflict and resolution, leadership, how you lead a team, how you lead in times of crises, and of course, relationships even among friends. And so all of those things, certainly for diplomacy, are front and center. And I think about some of the conflicts that we observed in Next Generation, and I'd say even more acutely in Deep Space Nine, not only with possible partners or adversaries, but among the team itself. And those were real, very real emotions. The actors were brilliant, of course. And many of those things reflect real world conflicts and relationships within an organization, within an office, sometimes within a family, let's be honest. So all of those things, let me hit specifically disability, because I noticed, even as an inclusion, even as a young Star Trek watcher, there was an episode in the original series, and I couldn't find it. I was looking last night, and of course, I started watching episodes. I got distracted, but it was Captain Kirk, and some of our audience may remember the line near the end of the episode. One of his officers was getting married. Two of them were getting married, and he's in the chair, and he makes the aside to Spock and the doctor. Oh, well, but I'm not losing an officer. I'm gaining a. And then he paused and he said, I'm losing an officer. And even at the age of 8, I thought, well, what is she going to do? It's not like she has to cook or clean her quarters. Why would she stop working? So that's that original one. But with regard to disability, I thought Star Trek Next Generation did really strong episodes that were really impactful, particularly because of the time. I think of Riva and, of course, Geordi as a main character, and keeping in mind that Star Trek Next Generation was from 1987 to 1994. The ADA, the American Disability Act, was not passed until 1990. So Geordi's role and embrace of his abilities, different than everyone else's, I am absolutely certain helped the ADA get passed. I'm absolutely certain of it, because it really made us all step back, take another look at our assumptions about what people can and cannot do.
This is, I think, a really interesting point that you're touching on here, is that Star Trek is a product of its time as much as it is imagining a future. So in this respect, sometimes it's envisioning what could be, and I think Geordi and his journey is a particular, the technologies that are available to help him be interact with the world despite his disability is one aspect of that. But how do you think about that, contextualizing these different series, the original series and the time period it takes place, and its maybe representation or lack thereof, compared to Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. And then looking forward to the series today, I'm thinking about Discovery and Strange New Worlds. They have a very different way of portraying not just individuals, but as you mentioned before, the relationships among them and the society or those that are around them. So how do you think about that question of its contextualizing?
Yeah. Well, you know, Star Trek from that perspective for me is pure joy, because it did even the original series by having the diversity on the bridge, the African-American woman, the Russian, at a time when we were still very much in the midst of the Cold War. Age difference, DeForest Kelley was not a young man. And then you had Chekhov, who was visually very young, all working together. And as they went through the episodes, and very deliberately, as we know now, they were addressing challenges within our own thinking about our society, excuse me, and the world. Whether it was the episode with the half black, half white, to parts of a planet and how they end that conflict by absolutely destroying themselves and their world. And how idiotic it seemed to us as viewers that, okay, one color's on one side and one color's on the other, to really make us think about some of our challenges with physical differences as Americans, whether it's race, whether it's national origin or something else. I know that they intended to address the Vietnam War. I was a bit young for that, so I wasn't really paying that much attention at the time. And I would say that Next Generation did a little less of reflecting so much external conflicts, and I'm happy to have that conversation until we get to Deep Space Nine. And of course, that started in 1993. And that very much reflected any number of conflicts around the world for us to think about and think about them in a different way. And again, that the challenges of diplomacy and warfare, quite frankly, of how much do you do holding on to your standards, your culture, your ideals, your values, and then seeing what's in front of you, which might require a lot of gray and how you deal with it. And Deep Space Nine did a brilliant job of that.
So I want to get to your article on disability and intergalactic environments. In the article, and again, I encourage people to read it. I think it's extremely well researched and well written, as you can tell. The ambassador has such a wonderful way with words. But in the article, you sort of give three case studies, episodes, and the characters. And so I think that's a really good way for us to talk about and ground our discussion. The one that I want to start with is the one that deals with Geordi La Forge, the Masterpiece Society. I mean, there's several episodes that deal with how he grapples with his vision impairment and how others perceive that. But you chose that episode for a reason. Could you explain the episode a little bit, and how do you make of it as it pertains to how we see how disability interacts with the future world?
Yeah, as you say, there were a couple of episodes with Geordi addressing the fact that he's blind. And for anyone who hasn't seen, he uses a visor, which was a hairband that they slid down over his eyes. Yes, to allow him to, I hesitate to use the word vision, and yet he could see. He knew with whom he was speaking and what was in front of him, but it was, for lack of a better word, electronically done directly to his brain. So they encountered a species that did gene therapy to remove any imperfections, and people's genes also led to what sort of careers they pursued. And he's engaging with scientists on this planet. And of course, it's an extremely advanced planet, but doom is impending. I can't remember if it's a planet or something else that's coming their way. And they had to figure out a way to solve it before their world was going to be destroyed. In the end, Geordi saw something via his visor that allowed them to find the solution. And he made an observation in a very lovely way, but very impactful, when he observed to these scientists of the highest caliber, if I was on your planet, number one, I wouldn't exist. And number two, we wouldn't have your solution. And so a reminder that different abilities, different ways of seeing or engaging in the world bring many different gifts and positive things. So that was very powerful. And, reminded me of earlier times, people with disabilities, whether physical or mental, were shut away. And Judy Hoonan, who was the first disability special representative at the Department of State, has an incredible book that talks about how people with disabilities were shut away, so no one saw them, and therefore people couldn't understand how much they would add to our society, to our culture. And it was hard for them to fight for it because they were out of sight, out of mind. And so Geordi's comment there was very impactful. I will say there was another one earlier that was with the doctor who said, Dr. Pulaski, who was a stand-in doctor for, I think, a season, and she said, we can fix your eyes and you can get rid of the visor. And that reminded me, and I'm sure others, of the debate about cochlear implants for people who are deaf, hearing impaired. And the debate about, do they do that and get hearing, or inhabit the world without hearing and engage with it in their own way? And so that episode I also found really interesting for how to deal with disabilities. One, if you have one, and accepting or how you might address it, and for the rest of us to set aside our biases and pre thoughts about what it means. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that I remember that scene because I think it's really important because it works on a few different levels, that interaction with Dr. Pulaski, because I think it kind of nips in the bud any audience concerns or curiosities. Why wouldn't he choose to fix this thing that we would see as wrong?
There you go.
But what it says, no, the way I interact with the world is the way that I interact with the world, and it is just as valid. So it's this
nothing
like
to
it works
fit.
on a couple. There's nothing to fit, right? Exactly, yeah. So the physicality the physicality affects the sensory perceptions, and those sensory perceptions affect your worldview and how you interact with it. So I think that's also important because, again, as a scholar, right, I think about how this affects how we think about intercultural relations or interpersonal relations, and that's a really important part of a tenet of Star Trek too, is thinking about maybe what anthropologists might call cultural relativism, or in diplomacy it would be respect for the society of the other, right? And so I think that treatment of Geordi in particular gets into it's a small moment, and that's, I think that's the second season.
But if you recall, Dr. Darcie, the actor, the character's expression when Dr. Pulaski suggested it, and he's like, no. Like, never occurred to him to think about or wish for something different. I mean, I found it very impactful. Yeah.
It's really impactful because it's saying this way of existence is just as valid, right? And I think that's important for us to think about in our real world, whether it's in our society or in diplomacy with others as well, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's go through the other two cases,
so then,
the other two episodes we talked about. The next one I want to talk about is the treatment of Melora in Deep Space Nine.
Yes.
Which is an episode that really stuck with me. Yeah.
Yes. And you know what? She quoted basically from the American Disability Movement. Melora comes from a planet that has a very low level of gravity. So when she joined Starfleet and started being in worlds where humanoids with our type of gravity are close to it, she found it difficult to move. And so she was wheelchair bound, and she had braces on her arms and legs in order to allow her to navigate consoles and walk when necessary, but she moved with a wheelchair. When she got back to her own quarters, she'd turn off the gravity and float in the air as she was used to doing. There's a discussion before she arrives as to whether they're ready to receive her. Have they made the necessary accommodations, changes? And they're all yes and blah, blah, blah. And then there is a meeting the next morning and she comes into it. And they all turn and they said, oh, we were basically just discussing you. And she said, well, I think it's important for me to be in any discussion of me. And this is something that the disability movement started, but other minority groups have adapted, which is nothing about us without us. You can't have a group of people who are not fully aware intrinsically of what we need, what we want in order to solve, and I won't even say solve problems, because she makes that point too. She says, you know, people talk about the Melora problem. There's no problem. There's no problem. Let me contribute as I can contribute. This was a really strong episode because she too was offered the chance to change her physiology so that she could work in our level of gravity. And again, she declined because it meant she could never go back to her own planet. So she declined as well. But she was feisty and she just reminded me of Judy because she's, you know, like, don't do that. Don't think you're providing an accommodation for me. I know what I need. I know what I can do. Let me do my job. It was, yeah.
Yeah, it's a really powerful episode. The last one that I want to talk about is also, I think, segues into a broader conversation about diplomacy as well. And is the episode in Next Generation, Loud as a Whisper,
Yeah.
which I'll let you maybe set it up, but it's about well, I'll let you set it up and,
No,
and
I mean,
explain why you
go
chose
right
that.
ahead. Yeah, go right ahead.
Well, the episode deals with a deaf mediator, a diplomatic mediator who was deaf and works in their society, works with others to help them interact with the world. And that was portrayed as being something as both a challenge but an opportunity in the course of the episode. Well, so can you explain why you chose that episode and what you make of it, not just in terms of its representation of different abilities, but also as a act of diplomacy?
Absolutely. It is a brilliant episode. When it's over, if you haven't seen it, go watch it. And it's amusing as well. The thing that was very cool about it is that because he doesn't hear, he comes with a chorus, like a Greek chorus, used in the way that Greek theater, the chorus moves the story along, the plot along, fills in information that the actors are not going to give themselves. In his case, it was 3 individuals, and they each represented a different aspect of them: the intellect, the passion, and then one to bind them together. Honestly, watch this episode. In any event, at one point in the episode, something, not to give it away for those who haven't seen, something prevents the chorus from functioning as designed. And he is left with trying to mediate a horrific, long-standing conflict between bitter enemies. And his chorus is going to help him do the mediating. And he was arrogant, this character, because he'd never failed until this point. But when he lost his chorus, he had to dig deep with some assistance, because none of us get anywhere without help, with some assistance into understanding that his loss, his now disability, could be an advantage and could help him get where he wanted to go a different way. Brilliant episode. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you think what lessons do you think in the real world that can be translated from that particular episode?
Oh, so many. And anyone who has negotiated not only on an international scale, but conflict between colleagues or family members, this is real, that the tools that you bring to mediation are not always fit for the purpose. They don't always work with your interlocutors. And you've got to think outside of the box sometimes. You have to step back and find other ways to get where you're going. And it is a reminder to anyone in a negotiation or in a mediating position to be flexible, to be prepared to pivot and to use things you might not ordinarily use. Really, really helpful reminders.
I like that too, because it's about, I mean, at the end of the day, mediation isn't about one side versus another. I mean, and it's pitting one side versus another, but it's truly about the relationship, right? So
Indeed.
sometimes those tools have to adapt to whatever those two parties are involved.
Yeah. Yes, we talk about win-win, but sometimes it's got to be lose-lose, meaning I feel like I did not get everything I wanted, or I didn't get most of what I wanted, but they didn't either. So it must be fair, as opposed to the really happy one, which is, okay, I got everything I wanted and I was able to give some things that I was willing to give, so they feel happy too. So sometimes it's the positive and sometimes it's the negative, and both can work for a mediator.
So in your other article, we've been talking about your article
Right.
on disability, but you wrote this other really great article too that I teach. I have in the past taught a course on Star Trek and diplomacy, and I'm going to be adding this to the syllabus if I ever teach it again. The article is called "Words Are Here on Top," and you explored the contrasting models of diplomacy that are represented in Star Trek. You call them the old world style and the new world style. I was wondering, can you elaborate on the ideas?
Sure.
And
Yeah, and where are we now, colleagues? Where are we now?
yes,
If we had done this conversation, 5 years ago, it would be a different conversation. So, old world, new world. I think, as we've all been brought up, if you've studied international relations, we think of the European uh, Roman, where it is basically might makes right. And as we got into a rules-based order, particularly post-World War II, where we really rules-based order, international law, all of these international law, international humanitarian law, law of armed conflict, LOAC, which I dealt with when I was at Cyber Command, all of these laws to ensure that minorities or smaller countries or weaker countries were not just wiped out or marched over because they were smaller, but trying to find a balance and equity for both or all parties. And the difference between cowboy diplomacy, Captain Kirk, we do love him, but he was very dashing and he was often dashing into conflict, versus the more cerebral Jean-Luc Picard, who was thinking about diplomacy at all times. Even when conflict was the result, he certainly started with diplomacy. And Next Generation showed, in a way that I argue Voyager did not, but Next Generation showed the efficacy and success of diplomacy repeatedly, even when it failed. There were times when he had conflicts with Romulans or Klingons that did not end up the way he wanted. He was always trying to open a new passage or a new partnership or a new way of mutual respect and understanding that did not always occur. Darmok is one of my favorite episodes.
favorite.
For those of you who have not seen it, think Gilgamesh, which I had to go back and read. And let me be honest, colleagues, try to read, because I did not have the time and the brain power to get into that as much as I wanted. But this was a case where, again, communication was a challenge. And not only that, but all the assumptions we make about the other, whether it's based on skin color or cultural background or nationhood or sexuality, all the things that make us distinctive human beings, this was so brilliantly written because the way of thinking was completely different. There wasn't a meeting. It was like this. I mean, it just, and they had to figure out a way. They had to figure out a way. Metaphors, very important. It took all of us. We were with the captain and trying to understand what is happening. What is he saying? And really, and that joy when you finally figured out this is a way in, this is where I can find or make a connection. A couple of real world examples, come to mind. As a diplomat, as a woman, as a brown woman, I went out for 30 plus years as not what people were expecting to see when I was overseas. Of people, asking, may I speak with an American? Of people based on color, of people waiting for my boss, or worse yet, because I swear it makes me mad if I even think about it, me hosting an event, a small one, with the head of the Chamber of Commerce when I was ambassador. And I had my political chief with me, mostly as note taker, and he spoke solely to the man, solely,
Yeah.
the entire time.
Yeah.
I teased him a little bit about it as he walked out the door, but there were some things I wanted to accomplish, and we got done even as he dismissed me because I have a womb. Kid you not. And I was the U.S. ambassador yeah, so I'll stop there. I want to throw a real example in, but yeah, you've got to set aside those biases and preconceptions. And that's what Star Trek repeatedly makes its audience do. And that is the value, particularly for diplomacy and conflict resolution, conflict avoidance even.
I think the other thing that's important here, and it just to talk about the Darmok episode and Captain Picard in particular, is I think for many of us, he is the paradigmatic captain diplomat, right? We grew up with him, or as he was the ideal in so many ways, but he's not imperfect in his. He's not perfect in his diplomacy, and he's not just measured, cold, calculating too. He gets emotional sometimes. There's certain things where he makes choices that are perhaps not in line with the Federation goals, or he has to deal with the Prime Directive. We could talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but in the Darmok episode, he gets very frustrated at a certain point. He's yelling at his counterpart and trying to negotiate this situation too. So in dealing with these barriers, it's not like this is picturing like these ideal people that are perfect and without emotional stakes in the game either, right? I'm sure there's a lot that's
but that's what makes it
to consider.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so powerful and so useful, because you really do identify with any of the captains that are feeling challenged or frustrated from time to time, but particularly as you knew the efforts he was willing to go to, although I would argue they all break the Prime Directive all the time. But the Star Trek Voyager, the captain in Voyager was probably a meld between Captain Kirk dashing off cowboy diplomacy and diplomacy as Captain Picard embraced it and used it. And Captain Janeway certainly talked about diplomacy as much as Picard did. But I would argue that she was not nearly as effective. And there was an episode where one of her interlocutors says, "We've heard about you and your ship, and you destroyed this, and you blew up that, and you kidnapped that, and blah, blah, blah." And all of these things have been happening on their journey. And we, of course, know why they did X, Y, and Z, but how it looks from outside is key and massively different, and something as a diplomat, as a negotiator, as a mediator, you have to keep in mind, not just what you're seeing, but what are others seeing of you? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a whole episode in Voyager where it's a society's reinterpretation, like of their I don't know if you remember this episode.
Yes,
the museum where they reinterpret based on their experience with Voyager. And so even if they were intending, the whole point of the episode is Voyager and Janeway intended a certain thing, but it was completely interpreted a different way in the local culture.
Yeah. There was one episode, it was a two-parter that I did not understand of the decision that she made. Most of them, I didn't necessarily agree with them because I did think she was too cowboy and could have used diplomacy. But there was an episode where, I guess it's a three-parter really, but where a planet had replicated the entire ship and crew, and they began to get ill. And yet, even when she knew that they were of a different planet, she still forged on toward Earth, killing everybody.
Yeah.
Never understood that.
That's a hard episode, or series, a couple of episodes.
Anyway.
I think, no, Janeway is an interesting, I mean, I think for any of the captains, we all attach like descriptors to them. The Kirk is the captain adventurer, Picard is the captain diplomat, Sisko is kind of a wartime he's not, doesn't have the title of captain, but he is on the front lines. For me, Janeway was the captain explorer. She was really driven by this inquiry. But the point that I also want to bring up and get your reaction to is they're also like context. It's not just about their personality or their persona, but they're context specific. And so I think that this probably has real world, implications for diplomacy too, because you stand on the shoulders of those that you can count on. And in the case of Janeway, she was in a different quadrant. She couldn't stand on the shoulders of Starfleet and the Federation and their allies. So she was really at it alone. And so I think that was a lot of the struggle that she had, is how do I adhere to the Prime Directive in particular when I have nobody to back me up? Yes. So my interfering with societies.
With her colleague who did not.
Yeah. So I wonder, how do you think about that? As a political scientist, I think about these, like the size of states matter, and what is your capacity and your capabilities and interacting with others in the world. From a practitioner perspective, how do you think about that context dependency for diplomacy?
Sure. And I think that's something that we all face from time to time, regardless of what your career is, the culture of your organization or your own background, and then being in places where it doesn't quite answer the mail. So you might have to modify it, and how you balance that cognitive dissonance of what you're doing. And I think in diplomacy, it happens a lot, depending on what the conflict is, because your knowledge and view of it is often not in concert with what the government's view of it and how the government has decided. And certainly in my own career, being in the Middle East, that cognitive dissonance lived with me daily with how we conducted ourselves in many conflicts there. That leads me to, and I think I saw it pop up in the chat about mental health. And they tried to deal with it, I think, in Next Generation, not so much in the original series. And it ties into leadership for me, because in the original series, it was Spock who was talking to the captain, questioning the captain, the doctor who was concerned about him in general, although not so much his mental health as his physical well-being. But Spock played the echo, the conscious, as it were, as he made his decisions. And I go to the opposite, for me, would be Deep Space Nine, where everybody was questioning Sisko. His first officer did, his old friend Dax, much more junior, did, Chief O'Brien did, everyone questioned Sisko. So he really had to explain himself to a lot of people in a way that Kirk did not, in a way that Captain Picard did not. The counselor role in Next Generation, I thought, was a step forward, although she did express her own frustrations with the attire, etc. But a step forward insofar as she was in the C-suite. She was considered to be a senior officer, a bridge officer. So putting mental health on the plane with everything else that the ship did. Now, obviously, taking care of the captain and the bridge crew, but there was a whole shop that she ran for the entire ship. And that sent, I believe, a really important message to all of us as we get out there, not to be afraid of going to see the counselor. Yeah.
Yeah. That's. I mean, we're getting some questions in this vein in the comments. I'm gonna start bringing them in. You addressed this question about mental health and therapy and counselors on the bridge. That was a question from Cindy, so thank you for that question. Peggy has an interesting comment about team diplomacy, and I think there's elements of that to this as well. This is an interesting. So Peggy says Kirk was half of a good diplomat. Spock was the other half. So how do you think when it comes, right? And you can see why.
I like it. Yeah, I like
Spock is very rational, but there's certain ways where that lacks the empathy of needing the intangible when it comes to be a diplomat too, right? So how do you think is balancing a team when it comes to leadership and diplomacy, whether it's from your own perspective as the leader, like in your capacity when you're ambassador working with your team, or when you're staffing a team? How do you think about putting together?
Yeah. Well, I certainly, as ambassador, looked for someone who had skills that I lacked. And then keep in mind, for everyone, you only get so much control over choosing your team, particularly if you work for the government. Then some of it's just the personnel system. But I thought that was important. I certainly, as I said, that balance. So for me, someone who was follow-up, detail-oriented, I have great, big, I think, awesome ideas, but I don't want to have to go back and implement them. Thank you. Somebody else is going to tag and tap the people who need to do that. I think back to Lincoln and his group of rivals that he pulled together for his presidency, looking for balance, and for me, most importantly, because it does not come easy to people who will challenge you, which Spock would do. Occasionally the Doctor would do in the original series. Picard was less challenged than any other captain, challenged. Now he was portrayed as, almost all-knowing and very wise, but the counselor did it now and again, and the first officer now and again, but behind closed doors, not in front. Whereas again, Cisco was challenged often and in public. And so it was fascinating for me to watch how he dealt with it. There was one scene where the Doctor has additional information about some refugees, and he interrupts the captain's meeting and starts asking questions, which moves the information along a little bit more. But at the end of the interaction, the captain says, "Don't ever do it again." And so going back to behind closed doors to do that. But sometimes people won't even do it behind closed doors. And that is disaster. It is disaster for the leader, and it is disaster for the team and who all else is there. Because if somebody isn't willing to give you unvarnished, this does not make sense. I'd like you to consider 2 or 3 alternatives. This is going to leave a bad taste in everybody's mouth. People will not understand your thinking here, and you need to explain it. All of those things that have to be said to leaders, and people are chosen for leaders, to be leaders, often because they've got the confidence and the self-belief, esteem. If I put an idea out there, I'm confident it's a pretty good idea and should work. People have to be willing to flag for me why it won't, or why I need to think of something else. And many disasters that have happened in our own nation, in organizations, come from subordinates not being willing to beard the lion in the den, as it were. And I certainly told my deputies, I had 2 while ambassador, I said, you must challenge me. That's why I'm hiring you, to challenge me. and we'll get where we need to go. But you cannot let me go off, thinking I've got all the answers, because no single person does.
It requires a special type of leader, I think.
Well,
Okay, we're getting a lot of questions about diplomacy and a lot about disability representation. So I'm going to group a few together. The first on diplomacy. Tim asks, I was thinking about Michael Burnham in Discovery and how she took the idea of the Federation far into the future when they did that time jump. He asks, the legends and mythology of the Prime Directive and the Federation's ideals that she took with her informed herself and her interactions with everybody else, and everybody wasn't like or knew where the Federation stood
Yeah.
in terms in the respective things. So he asks, to what extent is cultural mythology like this a helpful or hindrance in negotiations, or more broadly diplomacy with those that are not like you or don't know about you to begin with?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's both. It can be wonderfully helpful because it provides a shortcut, a shorthand in words and symbolism, especially if you understand the other's cultural mythology. It can be extremely helpful. It can help you avoid errors. It can help you not go down paths where you're going to meet strong resistance. But on the other hand, it is often a huge pain because people rest on that cultural mythology of who we were. I didn't spend a lot of time in Europe. My focus was the Middle East, but we'll leave that for now. And I remember my boss, God rest his soul, talking about Eastern Europe and Serbia and Croatia, and specifically saying battles that were 600 years ago still feel like yesterday for some people. And as negotiations were going on, all of that history, all of that cultural whatever can be a real hindrance in getting both parties, A, to yes, but B, to a better place. And so they have to be navigated, but they have to be understood. It's why a number of people have real concerns as to how our diplomacy is being conducted now, because there isn't time being taken to understand both sides. Time isn't being taken to understand what the cultural hindrances, hurdles, that, not saying that you have to honor them all, but you have to be prepared to address them and have a path to navigate around. So it's a double-edged sword. It can be useful if you know them, understand them, and have a way to work around them, and can blow everything up if you don't.
There's another question about negotiations that I think is really interesting. Danny asks, one of his favorite scenes in Star Trek is the scene in Deep Space Nine where Wei-Yun and Sisko are speaking very diplomatically. They are both trying to deceive each other, but they also know that they are trying to deceive, knowing the other is too. So
Great
there's many
scene.
layers of
Yeah.
yeah. So
Well, the words are on top. Yes.
they're on the top, exactly. So how he's asking about the real world implications of this, or the parallels. So how common is this dance between diplomats? What isn't being said is just as important as what is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, that goes back to the need for knowledge of the other, because without that knowledge, you have no way of discerning, are the words on top the same as the meaning below? You have no way of knowing that. Again, you got to do the homework. It's a brilliant scene, absolutely, because they are polite and agreeable, and we're going to solve this. And then as soon as they leave, it's like, call up the forces, get the shields ready. We're fighting in 2 days. I mean, it was brilliant, and absolutely something that you have to be aware of and navigate as a diplomat in negotiations, in mediation. You've got to know it for both sides. And Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Great point.
I'm collecting a couple questions on disability and representation in Star Trek. I'm gonna pair a couple together first because I think they're two sides of a similar coin. Cindy has an interesting observation on Geordi.
Mhm.
It says Star Trek seems to be always been quite inclusive compared to other sci-fi series or franchises like Star Wars. But one thing that they can't recall seeing is in Trek we also see war in Trek are prosthetics, except for Borgs and maybe except for Geordi.
Yeah.
With replicators, anything maybe they're just perfect and custom, like they blend with everything. So do you think that it's common and just not addressed uncommon, or do you think that people like Geordi just embrace their disability?
Yeah, I think people embrace their differences. I don't think Geordi would accept the word disability, and I will honor that. I think people would embrace their differences. Certainly, if you watch a number of series, you would see, while largely humanoid, um, physical differences that were dealt with in different ways. I'm thinking of Morn and Deep Space Nine. But it's also that ability, they solved a lot of problems. It's called the black box. Those of you who are science fiction fans know that, that box can solve everything. Star Wars uses it way too much. Star Trek, less so, but now and again. But, the tricoder, that tricoder, and there's a wonderful documentary that was on last night that touched on this, and the tricoder could do anything you wanted to do. It can scan bodies, it can find, or it can do this, that, and the other. But it was basically a black box for Star Trek. And so their ability to replicate hearts. I watched the one where Jean-Luc has
Yeah.
to replace his heart. They could do that. I mean, it's astounding to me, frankly, that anybody died. But they did have diseases that they hadn't yet resolved, and if you didn't get to the bio bed quickly enough, you could die. But they solved that with replication. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing what technology we can imagine. This is, I think, an interesting tangent on that question, but continuing to talk about disability
Yeah.
accommodations, Tim asks this really fabulous question, and I'm going to editorialize it a little bit. He asks, could we discuss the episode Sarek? This is, I think, the episode in The Next Generation when Spock's father comes to the ship to help with negotiations. But at the time, because of his age, Sarek had
Oh,
Bendai syndrome.
getting
Bendai
emotional.
syndrome.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and so it's a degenerative disease among the Vulcans that leads to them being very emotional, which is exactly counter to his ability to negotiate. And so, again, editorializing this question a little bit, this is something that's degenerative. It's not something that he's willing to accept, right? He is in fact a denial about it in many respects, and his wife is helping him deal with that. But he can't, because of it, he can't do the job he used to do, right? So I think there's a tension there too, is there is a limit to what we can think about, especially when one's own self can't accept a certain limitation or change that's going on.
Well, that's very human, isn't it? I
Yeah.
mean, one of the things that we've talked about in our Office of Diversity and Inclusion with regard to disability, it was always astonishing to me, resistance for accommodations. And we urged people
Oh,
to put down that they had a disability. People were reluctant because our society generally either sets aside or places limits on what you can do. I have had she's still at the department, but a brilliant lawyer on my staff who was blind and a diplomat. And, I had incredible staff, but certainly among the most capable, incisive, decisive, prickly, and in the best sense of the word, but challenging as well, because like Melora, she wasn't trying to take any crap from anybody, and she wanted what she knew her due was under the Disability Act. And the department, like any agency, was reluctant to step up as it was required. But one of the things that we talked about is that each and every one of us, if we are privileged or blessed to live long life, will have a disability. Therefore, we should be working to make it as possible to be engaged, to be included, to navigate, as we get older, arthritis, blindness, diabetes, all the things that come with age. We're all going to get there. We're going to be dead, one or the other. So we were always having discussions and reminding people of that reality. We're all going to have a disability. Let's put things in place that will be helpful to all of us. I was at a camping site the other day, and I saw little kids and old people. We were hiking, and they had a porta potty that was ADA compliant, so it was wide enough for a wheelchair. And I was like, this is awesome, great, great, great. And of course, it was extra space for me. So we should be doing these things. And wherever you are, in whatever organization, please be cognizant of, be an ally, speak up so that the person who has a disability isn't always the one fighting the battle. If it's a minority, make sure that that person isn't always the one flagging. This is a problem. This should be done a different way. Allyship is key for all of us.
That's very powerful. We're coming up on time, but I have time for a couple more questions. We've been talking a bit about physical abilities, but we talked a little bit about mental health, but I want to dig into this a little bit more. Different abilities isn't just how do you physically interact with the world or what are your sensory perceptions, but it's also now we're broadening our conversation to also talk about neurodivergence, how different thought patterns or logic patterns or mood disorders or different orders, how do you think that affects in the context of diplomacy and how it's represented? I don't know I think it's represented a bit in Star Trek. I just don't think it's named. I think we have characters that it's just accepted that they just think differently, irrespective of culture. It's not really about a culture. It's just they're different, right? They just are portrayed as maybe quirky or the solutions to things. So how do you parse that in the context of diplomacy and Star Trek?
Yeah, it's a challenge, and I don't have any right answers on it. I had the privilege of sitting on the selection committee for ambassadors, and my first year, we selected someone that we knew was neurodiverse. And talking about, again, not a problem because she was going to have to set up, but she had a career that showed she was successful in navigating the neurodivergence. Even if it was simply saying to staff, I need time to resettle, refocus. When you come to me, make sure that we're going to get this done within X amount of time or bring this number of things to me, at a time, not that you can't bring lots of things to me because of course that's the nature of the position, or flagging for others. Listen, this isn't a warning, but I'm informing you that, I have Tourette syndrome, if that's what it is. But talking about it in an open manner, and this is what Judy and the ADA, all of that was to bring people with differences and with disabilities out of the shadows. Once you know, oh, this is them, whether it's a physical difference or a neurodivergence. This is them, this is me. And people have to make accommodations for the way I see the world, the way I express myself, and we have to do it for others. The challenge, of course, is other nations, which in some ways are often not at the same place where we are. And I remember I did not get it done, and I'm hoping that this will be done in future. For the oral exam, coming into the diplomatic corps, you have to have a foreign language, and you have to either have one coming in or you have to have one before you are tenured, allowed to stay. And I had been advocating for sign language in different languages to count as the
Yeah.
language, not sign language per se, because
American.
that's not helpful if nobody else speaks it. But if you had not only American Sign Language, but French or Congolese or Thai, that should be your foreign language, because we have to use these. There are times when it's absolutely crucial that you have that information.
Yeah.
And so it was something that still needs work. Yeah.
Yeah. The last question I want to ask you before we wrap up is about the Prime Directive, which is the very basic tenet, I think, at the end of the day, about Star Trek. And I also think that it's very clearly resonant for how we conduct diplomacy. So, as a diplomat, what question or how do you evaluate what lessons does the Prime Directive offer us for real world international relations?
Yeah. Well, because it often was the case in Star Trek, the Prime Directive, and certainly for us, it is a set of values and ideals that we adhere to, that we study in the United States about rule of law and fairness and so on and so forth. And so those are words on top. The meaning underneath, unfortunately, still remains largely in our history, even post World War II, that might makes right. That we criticize others for not adhering to the Prime Directive, our Prime Directive, and yet we fail. And we have many examples ongoing right now, thinking about places like Sudan, Gaza, Congo, Myanmar, so many places where what we say we stand for, we're not living up to. And so that failure in Star Trek is a reflection of the real world. I think we're off the path of striving for it right now. And it's something that we have to work hard, all of us together, to get back to, because most of us would say that's the kind of world we want to live in, where rules matter, where fairness, where equity and inclusion that allow us to meet our full potential, not have a leg up, but to be allowed to meet our full potential. That's the world we want to live in. And that's what makes Star Trek very special, very useful for us all to keep watching.
Thank you so much. I think everybody agrees that you're just captivating to listen to. So I really appreciate answering all these questions.
Pleasure.
So we couldn't get to all of them. Unfortunately, we're at time, so we're going to have to wrap up. But thank you for participating in this, Ambassador. Thank you to everybody that's tuned in to listen and ask questions. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. We also encourage you to attend more of these Hopkins at Home's free public virtual content. For more information, you can visit hopkinsathome.jhu.edu. So thank you again, and have a wonderful night. Live long and prosper.
Live long and prosper.